My mother was born in Nebworth, Hertfordshire, and they were married there, and my father was born in London. My mother's name was Barbara Adamson, and my father's name was Herbert Joseph Peters. My parents were married in St Martin's Church in Nebworth, Hertfordshire. They were married on the 23rd day of December in 1916. My parents had me first, my name Barbara Daphne Peters, on the March the 7th, 1919, in my mother's house in Ventnor, Isle of Wight, England. The house I was born in was built in 1878, but they hadn't owned it all that time. They bought it when my grandmother remarried after the death of her first husband, my father's father. The house, as far as I know, is still standing, and it's in the Grove, and it was called St Catherine's. Yes, I had a brother, and he was born in December the 18th, 1923. My brother's name was Geoffrey Adamson Peters. I must have lived in Nebworth for 3 years when my father got a job with the London North Eastern Railway in Birmingham in the Midlands. For we moved there to 264 Fort House Lane, Birmingham. That is where my brother was born, in the house, and it was 264 Fort House Lane, and it is still standing. It was a semi-detached council house, and we had the railway line at the back of us, and trains would come back and forth quite a bit. Then my father got a job with the railway as assistant fish market superintendent in Grimsby in Lincolnshire. Yes, we moved to and rented a house in the village of Healing. I was about 15 and my brother was about 9 or 10.
So had you?
Went to Cleethorpes Secondary School for Girls, and I matriculated in about 1936, I think. after I graduated school, I got a job in a fish curing firm in the accounts department. And I was there probably 2 years. And my headmistress of Cleethorpes Secondary School wrote to say that there was a job going in the National Provincial Bank and I should apply, which I did, and I got the job, and that was doing accounts on machines. I was working in that job after war started, as we were not expected to go into the forces because our job was necessary and the men were all going, that we were taking positions like the men had, which we would never have had but for war. And I became a teller, as we call them, or a cashier in Grimsby Docks branch. There were two, see. No, I was 19, I think, when I went in. And I was there after I met my future husband, who was Calvin William Rolls.
Okay.
I met my future husband at a dance in Cleethorpes for New Year of 1942. He came across the floor to ask me for a dance. So, quite romantic. There was such a crowd. Everybody was there. You could hardly dance. I didn't even realise he couldn't dance.
Evening.
I know he lost his greatcoat, and my father always said he and found a wife. And we were married on December the 12th, 1942. My husband was born in Boston, USA, on the 9th of July, 1920. His parents had gone down perhaps a year before, and they didn't stay because his next brother was a year and a half younger, and he was born in Hermitage, Newfoundland, when my father-in-law was a school teacher. My in-laws' names were Harry Valentine Rolls, and my mother-in-law was Irene Marion Horwood prior to marriage. And they had 3 sons. Bill, my husband, was first. The second was a year and a half behind him, born in January the 14th. No. I think it was the 16th in 1922. That would be it. And Gordon was born in 1937 in Cornerbrook. Then, I think after they were there for so long, they moved back to Rose Blanche. And my father-in-law was in the business that his mother's father owned. And then my mother-in-law was had two brothers besides herself, and the three men took over the business, but they didn't make a go like her father had done. He had a very successful business, Horwood and Sons, I guess, and it was all to do with fish and exporting it. But he was very ingenious that he cut his ice from and stored it in down underground and for the summer, and they exported salmon and they exported cod, salted, and cod liver oil. They had a factory there, and it was a very successful business. My husband's parents left Rose Blanche because things got difficult in the 30s and moved to Cornerbrook because the mill had just started up. The paper mill had just started up there. Well, the two older children, of course Gordon wasn't born then, volunteered to go to war in 1939, and they trained and they volunteered for the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and they were trained out in Western Canada, Calgary. It was his brother Harry that volunteered one day, and my husband volunteered the next in the Air Force. Else he always said to me, he would have volunteered in the Navy, knowing so much more about boats, because in Rose Blanche their only mode of transportation was boat. There was no road anywhere except around Rose Blanche and Harbour Coup. When war started, I would have been, if I hadn't been a female, I would have been in the first draft. I was 20. I was living in Healing, Lincolnshire, and I was working in the bank, and therefore I was a girl, and I didn't have to volunteer because I was in a secure position. My husband trained in Western Canada, and he also got engaged to a girl out there. But then he came, then they were prepared enough to go overseas. And they came back through Canada and went by ship from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to Iceland. They stopped there. They were in convoy. And then from Iceland, they went, I imagine, to Liverpool. And from there, they were shipped they went to Bournemouth. And from there, they trained from Cranwell in Rutland. It was where everybody trained. And when they were in Western Canada, they had too many people wanting to be pilots, and for some reason they both were put into wireless operators, air gunners. It must have been 1941. Grandpa, or shall I say, my husband trained in Cranwell, and he went AWOL a lot of times, not only then, but before while he was out in Western Canada, he came back to go salmon fishing in Newfoundland. And then he'd return. So he had a lot of points against him. So by the time they got trained, and he and a fellow, Jerry Plowman, volunteered. And by the time I met him, which he was at Northcotes, he had done a tour of operations and came up there for a rest and was on air sea rescue. And it was fortunate he never was called back to go on bomber command. Now that's what he was on, bomber command. Wireless operator, air gunner, and you were in the middle of the plane. And then there was air gunners on the end was the worst job of all, because you couldn't get out of it. You were lucky if you lived. But I mean, there's an awful lot of lives gone in the Air Force. I don't think anybody taught of war when they came home, because my father didn't ever talk about the First World War. And I mean, he was in a London regiment until he got into the Tank Corps. So we were fortunate because we were in a village outside of Grimsby, and Grimsby was bombed, but not much. I was in a raid that the Germans did once around dinner time. I was in the bank, and this plane came over us, and low, because radar would have picked it up, but it came and it dropped 3 bombs, and they were just all around us, and there was a lot of life in one place because it was a factory of girls. A lot of girls were killed. Another was a shop that had just closed up because it was early closing that day, and the other was a pub that was bombed. But we were in the middle of it, so we didn't get anything, luckily. Grimsby there was no fishing. They'd taken all the boats that the government had, and so there was no port as such. That's why we didn't have much work, because all our customers were fishing and fishing industry, where there were 2 banks, and the other one was Grimsby Town, and they would still have work, more work than us. I managed to get to this dance where I met him, because otherwise we would have worked.
So,
on the night we met, which was in Cleethorpes, he had come from Northcotes with a crowd and went to a hotel first, and they were playing the piano there, which he enjoyed, but then they decided they'd come on to the dance, and it was he that recognised or saw me and came across and had a dance. And then he arranged to meet me the next night, and from there we continued on. But I was living with my parents in the village of Healing, which was 2 stops from Grimsby, and the last train was 10:10. So if you were stuck in Grimsby, if you missed that one. But I was with my friend Patsy and another girl from the bank in this dance hall. We met on the 1st of January 1942, and we were married on December the 12th, 1942. Well, rations weren't too bad by 1942, and my parents had the wedding catered. Patsy, who was married, as my bridesmaid. My good friend from Birmingham was in the forces, couldn't come, and Grandpa's brother, Harry, was in the forces and he couldn't come. And there was my brother wasn't in the forces then, so he was there, and Mother and Dad. It was only a little church that it was full, but it was parishioners, Peter and St. Paul. You know, it was a very old church, and the arches to do with the Vikings, and it was from 11 something or other. I joined him, you see, in the end of January of 1943. Yeah, the January of 43. I didn't work in the bank long after I got married. Well, we travelled around Britain, and especially down the south, where he was in air sea rescue, and we were either in Devonshire or Dorset, but first we went to Norfolk, Courtisham, and then he was about 8 days after D-Day. In D-Day, we were down in a place called Salcombe in Devon, which had been American ships in the harbour, and there wasn't one on D-Day. I've got the letter that Eisenhower wrote to the troops. Grandpa put it in his album. 8 days after, he had to get me up to Healing because he was going overseas to France. Well, he developed a stomach ulcer, and that took him off flying. He was in Rouen Hospital. In the February of 1945 was when we came over to Montreal. Well, he came off flying, and they sent him up to Inverness, and from there, this is what they decided, that he was to be a briefing officer in Dorval Aerodrome. We lived in Montreal we landed in New York. We didn't know where we were coming, and We landed in New York on the 3rd of March 1945, and we came up at night by train to Montreal, and we luckily, after one night in a crappy hotel where the Red Cross put us, to these people, Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, who had 3 children, and they were in Notre Dame de Grace. And from there, Grandpa went to the airport every day, or when he was on duty.
How did you?
It was in the September, but before that, we came to Newfoundland in May. It all was in a train and ship from Sydney to Port aux Basques, and from there train to Corner Brook, which we came in Corner Brook on a Sunday afternoon. I don't know what date. With David was a year and just over a year.
Where was David?
Our first son, David, was born in April the 8th, 1944, in Bournemouth, Hampshire.
Okay.
We were met at the railway station by his parents, my husband's parents, and Gordon, who was about 7 years old, and their friends, and my mother-in-law was the volunteer organist at the church of St. John the Evangelist, and the bishop had come to the church, and she was playing for a service that night, which she did. We lived with them while my husband was stationed in Gander, and he was discharged just before Christmas in Montreal. We bought a house in Curling, opposite the War Memorial, which is still down there, and our second child, Barbara Irene Rolls, was born in Corner Brook Hospital. On the 1st of August 1944, and our third child was born on September the 7th, 1953 in Cornerbrook. Derek John Rolls. And unfortunately, he died when he was 45 of a massive heart attack. October the 6th. We lived in various places in Cornerbrook and Steadybrook and 19 years. Then we moved when my husband got a job as a fisheries officer, and it turned out he was supposed to be in Bonavista Bay, and the place we were supposed to live was Gambo, but we couldn't find a place suitable, and we moved to Traytown. My husband had to retire when he was 51 because of a heart condition. He managed to live, and he died in the health sciences when he was 71. He died of, he had emphysema, a heart condition, and then he got cancer of the lung. We used to come back and forth and live with you people for winter for 1 or 2 years, and then after he passed away, I was 2 years when I used to go back to Traytown and live in the summer. When I left Traytown, we moved into Torbay in this apartment that I'm in now. I'm 94 and I was 72 when he passed away. Well, I never thought I would end up in Newfoundland for the rest of my life. I was going out with a fella from the bank. Not that we were real, we were just friends. I didn't miss him. I went out with other fellows before Grandpa. I regret what I did to my parents because I was the only girl. But Irene was a very good daughter-in-law. No, she made up for me. When I think of, they came to Liverpool to see us off, and it must have been very hard on them because in those days you didn't know when you were going to see your children again. Not like today. Well, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else than Newfoundland, but I'd like to get out of it in the winter time. July the 12th, 2013.